The courtroom was engulfed in heavy silence. Jury members sat in their seats, scanning the case files in front of them. In the front row, members of the press were ready with their cameras and notebooks, anticipating every moment. Seated in the defendant's chair was a young black man, Malcolm Reed. Malcolm closed his eyes tightly and took a deep breath. Today was the most important day of his life. Would he walk out as a free man, or would the system continue to crush him? The prosecutor slammed his stack of papers onto the table and turned to the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are looking at a murderer. Detective James Holloway was killed in the line of duty. And do you know whose fingerprints were found on the murder weapon? The defendant, Malcolm Reed.
A murmur spread through the courtroom.
This is a setup. I've never even seen that gun. Someone is framing me.
Oh, of course. The same old excuses. The fingerprints on the murder weapon are yours, but you claim to be innocent?
Malcolm clenched his jaw. Even his own words felt useless.
Order in the court. Defense attorney, would you like to speak on behalf of your client?
Michael Thompson, Malcolm's defense attorney, stood up. A seasoned, composed lawyer, but even he knew today's battle would be tough.
Your Honor, my client, Malcolm Reed, is innocent. The murder weapon is a fabricated piece of evidence. Today, in this very courtroom, we will prove who the real criminal is.
Tension rippled through the courtroom. No one knew what would happen next, but Malcolm had only one thought running through his mind. I have to win this fight. The tension in the courtroom had escalated noticeably. The jury members were fixated on the defense attorney, waiting for him to present the evidence that would prove Malcolm's innocence. The prosecutor smirked, as if he had already won the case. However, when attorney Michael Thompson leaned over his desk and opened a file, that smirk quickly faded.
Your Honor, the prosecution claims that the murder weapon is the only piece of evidence, but this morning, we discovered new evidence.
What kind of nonsense is this? If you had new evidence, why didn't you present it earlier?
Because someone tried to bury it, but thanks to our investigation, the truth is finally coming to light.
Michael Thompson turned to face the jury and the entire courtroom. He held up a document and projected it onto the large courtroom screen. A DNA test result. Whispers spread across the courtroom. The judge struck his gavel firmly.
Maintain order in the court. Attorney Thompson, explain the relevance of this test.
This DNA sample was taken from blood found at the crime scene. And interestingly, it does not belong to Malcolm Reed.
A sudden silence fell over the courtroom.
What did you just say?
This is impossible. What does this mean?
It means, Your Honor, the real killer is sitting right here in this courtroom.
The courtroom erupted into chaos, but Michael Thompson was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the true culprit. The tension in the courtroom was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The jury exchanged glances, while Prosecutor Brandon's face turned to stone. Attorney Michael Thompson gripped the document tightly as he rose to his feet. His words had to be chosen carefully. What he was about to reveal would change the entire course of the trial.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are all here to determine whether a man is guilty or innocent. But let me ask you this. What if the evidence presented to you is only a fraction of the truth? What if the story you've been told is incomplete?
The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats.
Facts don't come in halves, Attorney Thompson. They either exist or they don't. What you're doing is spinning a story.
Michael Thompson took a deep breath and turned directly to the jury.
Is that so, Prosecutor? Then explain why the real DNA found at the crime scene doesn't belong to Malcolm Reed, but to a police officer.
The room went silent. Prosecutor Brandon's smirk vanished instantly. The jury members' eyes widened, and the courtroom spectators began murmuring.
Order in the court. Attorney Thompson, please continue your explanation.
Michael Thompson held up the forensic report. A large screen displayed the results, showing that the blood found at the crime scene did not belong to Malcolm Reed, but to Detective Eric Sullivan, the officer who arrested him.
Here it is. This blood sample does not belong to Malcolm Reed. This DNA belongs to Eric Sullivan. So tell me, Detective Sullivan, how did your blood end up at the crime scene?
Detective Sullivan froze in his seat. Sweat formed on his forehead.
This is impossible. This must be a mistake.
You just said facts don't come in halves, didn't you, Prosecutor? So what do you have to say about this one?
The courtroom erupted into chaos.
Order! Detective Sullivan, the court demands an explanation.
Detective Sullivan's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for an escape.
I was the first officer on the scene. That's why my blood could be there.
Michael shook his head slowly. Sullivan was out of places to hide.
Really? And yet, somehow, your fingerprints are nowhere to be found on the murder weapon. Malcolm's are there, but his DNA isn't at the crime scene. Now tell us, Detective, How do you explain that contradiction?
The jury whispered amongst themselves. Prosecutor Brandon glared at Detective Sullivan, knowing that whatever he said next could decide his fate. For a long, deafening moment, the courtroom fell into a chilling silence. But Michael Thompson still had one final card to play, because the most shocking truth had yet to be revealed. A storm was raging in the courtroom. Detective Eric Sullivan sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as a ghost.
Bring order to the court. Detective Sullivan, do you have anything to say in your defense?
Detective Sullivan placed a trembling hand on the table. He was breathless, his eyes darting around frantically.
I was the first officer on the scene. That's why my blood was there.
Really? And yet, somehow, your fingerprints are nowhere on the murder weapon. Malcolm's are there, but his DNA isn't at the crime scene. Now, explain that contradiction.
Detective Sullivan clenched his jaw, sweat dripping down his temple. He could feel the walls closing in. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Detective Sullivan had run out of lies, and Michael Thompson knew it. The question now was, would he confess, or would he go down fighting? The silence in the courtroom was as heavy as concrete. Detective Eric Sullivan was sweating, his breath uneven. All eyes were locked on him.
Detective Sullivan, if you do not tell the truth about this murder, the court has the right to impose the maximum penalty. Make no mistake, your silence will not help you.
Detective Sullivan swallowed hard. He shut his eyes, clenched his fists, and took a deep, shaky breath.
He was going to expose us. Holloway was going to reveal the corruption within the police department. If he talked, many officers would have ended up behind bars. I just wanted to silence him, but things got out of control. That night I went to confront him, but everything spiraled. I never meant for him to die.
A wave of shock spread through the courtroom. The spectators murmured in disbelief. The jury members leaned in toward each other, whispering. Even Prosecutor Brandon was frozen, his eyes narrowed, breath shallow.
I can't believe this. A police officer murdered his own?
Michael Thompson leaned against the table, his piercing gaze fixed on Sullivan. The puzzle pieces had finally fallen into place.
Detective, what did you hope to accomplish by silencing Holloway? Did you really think justice had a price? Because of officers like you, innocent men like my client almost spent their lives in prison.
Sullivan lowered his head. He had spent years standing in this courtroom as a respected witness. Now, he was the one on trial.
After reviewing all the evidence presented in this case, the court finds Malcolm Reed not guilty. Detective Eric Sullivan is found guilty of murder. Furthermore, an independent investigation into corruption within the police department will be launched immediately.
Malcolm Reed closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had almost been another casualty of a broken system. How many more like him were out there? But today, justice, finally, found the right man.